Today I'm looking at an issue that I've run into recently with the ultra-wide camera, and it ain't good. When Apple announced the iPhone 13, I was very happy to learn that the ultra-wide was getting a new camera system and a new f1.8 aperture. I love the look of shooting with the ultra-wide for both video and photos, but its performance in any kind of low light or even just dim light was really pretty bad. Now it's definitely much improved, and it has that great macro focusing feature too, which I really do like. However, as I started using it more and more, I noticed an issue. I shot some gimbal footage for a client and was using a variable ND filter, and I saw lots of video noise in the shadows. I made a video about that project, and here's what I said about that problem. But one thing that can happen, especially using a variable ND, you have it cranked all the way down because you're shooting in bright light, but then if you shoot in shadow areas, the phone will auto ISO up when you reset the exposure, and you won't realize it, especially doing a run and gun shoot, and you'll underexpose the shadows and create noise and artifacts. So in those situations, you'd want to lessen the ND. The overall point here, or really a warning, is to always pay attention to your ISO, even when shooting outside in bright light. You want to keep that ISO low. And that's true. Some of my footage was affected that way, but not all of it. After the fact, I looked at the details about the video and noticed the ISO was actually good, and in some cases it was low. Anything under 100, you will typically have minimal noise. So something weird's going on. And then I did another video comparing FiLMiC Pro to the native camera app, both shooting ProRes video. And this time, I purposely did not use neutral density filters, and the same thing happened. One big thing I did discover is the ultra-wide camera has some additional dynamic tone mapping issues around digital gain, especially when shooting in high contrast scenarios. That's both in the native camera app and FiLMiC Pro. And so that brings me to this video. I shot some test footage to demonstrate this issue, and this is kind of a standard shot you might shoot. There's the sun and a tree. That's not an uncommon shot at all. And at first glance, it looks pretty good. But when you zoom in and look at the darker areas of the tree, it's really bad. Very noisy and muddy. It looks compressed. And by the way, this is BT 2020, so HDR, but it's conformed here to SDR. But you are getting some nice dynamic range with the bright sun in the shot looking into the tree. And this is the main wide camera, and it does much better. There is still some minimal noise in there, but we're shooting on a phone with a small sensor. This just looks much better than the ultra-wide. Here's a side-by-side to really demonstrate that point. Ultra-wide on the left, very noisy, almost unusable, standard wide on the right. One interesting side note is the dreaded green dot flare is on the wide lens though, and the ultra-wide, the flare looks okay. I'd really never noticed a difference between the two, so that was interesting as well. So that's a high contrast outdoor shot. Now let's look at an indoor shot. This is a fairly typical indoor shot, lighting the scene with the natural light, the sunlight. At first glance, it looks pretty good, but when you zoom into the shadow areas, wow, it looks bad. The shadows are completely falling apart, full of video noise, muddy, compression artifacts, you name it. And that's the kind of noise that can't be denoised in post-production, at least not very well. And so now here is the same shot with the standard wide lens. Overall, it looks pretty nice and fairly similar to the ultra-wide. Then when you zoom in, the shadows look fine. So again, the standard wide holds up. And here's the side-by-side to really bring that point home. The ultra-wide is really almost unusable. These examples were shot with FiLMiC Pro, but it does the same thing with the native camera app. So my speculation of what's going on here is this is dynamic tone mapping at work. These are low ISO shots, by the way, most under ISO 35. And the main part of the image is properly exposed and looks good. It's just the shadows and the phone doesn't exactly know what to do with it, and it's trying to even things out. And it's adding a lot of digital gain. Typically, when you think of dynamic tone mapping, you think of it adjusting the image. You can see it, and I've done several videos showing that recently. And it most often happens in scenes like this, high contrast scenes, where objects are moving across the frame. Well, in this case, there's nothing moving across the frame, but the extreme contrast, the dynamic tone mapping, is going into overload. I've talked to a FiLMiC Pro engineer, and he's seen this as well. Now, the small sensor, again, has something to do with it too, but considering the wide lens, which is an f1.5, is considerably better than the ultra wide, and that's an f1.8. So f1.8 is a pretty nice wide open aperture, and it's not that much worse in quotes than 1.5, but the results are obviously dramatically different. Interestingly, if you shoot something and the shadows are crushed, they're very dark, and you still have high contrast in the scene, like these pool shots, then everything seems to work okay. The digital noise is hidden more in the shadows. So while computational imaging is really cool, and especially for photography, this all works better in my opinion with photography. With video, you are getting better dynamic range, but at the expense of not being able to lock the settings properly, and as I've shown here, with the ultra wide in particular, it's adding a lot of digital gain in the darker shadow mid-tone areas of the image. And by the way, if you're wondering if this only happens with BT 2020 or HDR footage that I showed here, no, it happens with everything. So I shot one more test of my pool, and this is ProRes HQ BT 2020, very high contrast. When you zoom into the fence, you can see the issues here. Now here's the same shot, Rec 709. Same issues. This is ProRes though, and that's an important point. Now this is Dolby Vision HDR, conform to SDR. It holds the sky nicely, but when I zoom into the fence, it looks terrible. And it actually looks worse than the ProRes. This is HEVC. It does not resolve the image nearly as well as the ProRes. The ProRes is noisy, this is noisy and very muddy, and you actually lose detail. Now here is 10-bit Rec 709 natural, so this is HEVC as well. This is using the FiLMiC Pro cinematography kit. Very similar looks as before. You push into the fence, muddy as all get out. And again, does not hold as well as ProRes. And now this is FiLMiC Pro Log V3, again 10-bit HEVC, getting some nice dynamic range. We're seeing some nice blue sky back there, and some of the other shots, the sky was blown out. So that's an advantage to log here. But look at that fence, the dark area. Wow, not good at all. Am I still gonna use the ultra wide? Yeah, I'm just gonna be really careful about how I use it. So really that means in evenly lit scenes, or maybe in darker scenes where the shadows are crushed. I'll avoid high contrast shots where the shadows are lifted, which of course, unfortunately, is a lot of the kind of stuff we tend to shoot. The best solution in reality is to use the standard wide iPhone lens and add an external ultra-wide converter, like from Moment or B-Script, etc. Then you're using the best iPhone camera to get that cool ultra-wide look. Definitely not as convenient, but the quality is much, much better. Hopefully one day soon, the dynamic tone mapping issues will be completely resolved. It's getting better, it's getting closer, but we still have a ways to go. Thanks for watching. This is Blake Calhoun. Please like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.